In the unforgiving grip of that spring, a mother black bear named Vera confronted the most soul-shattering decision of her life. Her once mighty frame, a towering emblem of strength and unyielding presence in the wild, had withered into a skeletal shadow of its former grandeur, each trembling step sending waves of bone-deep exhaustion through her emaciated form. The sinew that had once rippled beneath her thick, glossy coat now hung slack, her ribs casting stark ridges against patchy fur that barely clung to her wasted body. Yet it wasn't her own suffering that fueled her resolve. It was the faint, heart-wrenching whimpers of her two dying cubs, Tavrin and Liska, that cleaved her spirit and thrust her beyond the boundaries of her natural instincts. The winter that preceded this desperate season had been a merciless tyrant, its icy fingers lingering far beyond their rightful reign, cloaking the Emberfall forest in a shroud of unrelenting frost. When Vera ushered her cubs from the dark sanctuary of their den, the forest that should have unfurled before them in a tender embrace of spring bounty, ripe berries glistening in the dawn, fresh shoots piercing the thawed earth, remained locked in a desolate, wintry vice. Day after grueling day, she led Tavrin and Liska across their ancestral foraging grounds, her massive paws crunching through brittle leaves and frost-rimed soil, only to find barren thickets where once abundance thrived. The small prey that typically skittered through the underbrush, rabbits darting between roots, voles rustling in the shadows, squirrels chattering from the boughs, had vanished as if swallowed by the silence, leaving behind an eerie stillness that seeped into the marrow of the woods. Her cubs, born amidst the howling blizzards of winter's peak, had never tasted the richness of a full meal. Their tiny bodies, which should have swelled with youthful vigor and plump vitality, had shrunk into frail husks, their once lustrous black fur now a dull, patchy veil revealing skin stretched taut over fragile bones. Each movement they made was a quiet testament to their decline. Their legs, once sturdy enough to chase the wind, quivered beneath them like saplings in a storm, and the joyful tumbles that should have filled their days had dissolved into a haunting lethargy that chilled Vera to her core. Her instincts, honed through years of survival in the wild, bellowed at her to keep her family nestled deep within the forest's embrace. Far from the snapping jaws of wolves that roamed the dusk, the territorial growls of rival bears echoing through the ravines, and the distant, unnerving hum of human trails that skirted its edges. Yet, as she watched Tavrin and Liska fade with each sunrise, a deeper, primal force surged within her. A fierce maternal tide that had carried her through 2 pregnancies, weathered storms that felled ancient pines, and outlasted hungers that gnawed at lesser spirits. Now it shoved her toward a choice that loomed unthinkable, a precipice she'd never dared approach. For weeks, Vera had poured every ounce of her dwindling might into the hunt for sustenance. She'd clawed through the frozen earth until her paws bled, crimson staining the icy crust as she unearthed meager roots and grubs, pathetic morsels that crumbled to dust in her jaws, offering no reprieve for her starving cubs. She'd ventured into shadowed corners of the forest, where the air thickened with the musk of danger, risking skirmishes with predators. A lean coyote pack that circled with glinting eyes, an old grizzled bear whose roar rattled the trees, in her frantic quest for nourishment. Each foray ended in hollow defeat, the forest yielding nothing but silence and frost, and each failure tightened the noose around Tavrin and Liska, dragging them nearer to a fate Vera refused to name. Their suffering became a relentless specter haunting her every breath. Tavrin, the bolder of her pair, who once bounded ahead to sniff every curling fern and chase the flicker of a falling leaf, now pressed himself against her flank, curling into her warmth as if to hoard the last embers of his strength. His eyes, once twin beacons of curiosity that mirrored the stars, had dimmed to muted pools, reflecting only weariness. Liska, smaller and more fragile, had surrendered her fight to walk, her delicate limbs too weak to bear her weight. Vera carried her gently in her jaws, feeling the cub's rapid, shallow breaths flutter against her muzzle. A weight so feather-light it pierced her with dread. Their cries for milk, once sharp and insistent, had softened to frail whispers, unanswered by Vera's own body, which withered alongside theirs, its once rich stores of fat and vigor eroded by the endless cold. As the sun dipped low after another fruitless day, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fading gold, a familiar scent curled on the wind, the sharp, acrid bite of human settlements, a peril she'd been taught to dread since her own cubhood, when her mother's growls had warned of two-legged shadows that brought noise and ruin. Yet entwined with that scent was a whisper of salvation. Food. It drifted like a phantom, perhaps the sweet tang of overripe fruit, the earthy promise of garden roots, the faint savor of discarded meals. In that fleeting twilight, gazing down at Tavrin and Liska huddled against the cold earth, their breaths misting faintly in the chill, Vera made a choice that would not only reshape their lives but etch itself into the hearts of countless humans in ways no one could have dreamed. With the last rays of daylight bleeding behind the jagged peaks, she summoned the remnants of her strength, her muscles trembling beneath her wasted frame, and turned toward the distant flicker of human lights. Her maternal fire, a blaze fiercer than her fear, propelled her into the abyss of the unknown, gently lifting Liska in her jaws, so light she barely registered, and nudging Tavrin forward with a tender press of her nose. She embarked on a journey that would soon leave an entire community drenched in tears. Dawn's first blush kissed the sky in soft pinks and silvers as Vera and her cubs breached the forest's edge, their dark silhouettes weaving through the morning mist like ghosts of the wild. Vera's once graceful stride had crumbled into a stumbling lurch, her paws dragging through the dew-soaked grass. Every few steps, she paused, her amber eyes, clouded with exhaustion yet alight with fierce love, sweeping over her cubs, tracking their faltering progress with a tenderness that belied her own collapse. Tavrin trailed behind, his legs quaking like reeds in a gale, his path a halting dance of effort and surrender. He'd pause, swaying as fatigue clawed at him, muster a breath, then press on, his tiny form a shadow of the cub who once raced the wind. Vera carried Liska, her daughter's faint breaths a fragile rhythm against her muzzle. So faint they seemed to teeter on the edge of silence, a terror that gnawed deeper with every step. As they ventured into the human settlement, a torrent of alien sensations engulfed them. Sounds sharp and jarring, the rumble of engines rolling like distant thunder, the clatter of metal gates swinging shut, the murmur of voices rising and falling like a strange tide. Scents swirled in a dizzying dance. The bitter sting of gasoline, the fleeting sweetness of blooming flowers, the musky allure of cooking fires long extinguished. Vera's instincts shrieked to retreat, to melt back into the forest's embrace where the rules were hers to command, but the tantalizing aroma of sustenance. Apples fallen from a tree, carrots buried in a garden, the ghost of a meal left on a porch, drew her onward like a beacon. Her nose twitched, sifting through the chaos, each whiff a lifeline threading through her exhaustion, urging her to defy the collapse threatening to claim her. The neighborhoods they crossed lay cloaked in early stillness, their quiet broken only by the occasional sweep of a car's headlights slicing through the haze. Vera froze at each intrusion, her massive form flattening to the ground, pressing Tavrin and Liska close. His trembling frame quivering against her leg, her daughter's stillness a weight in her jaws. Fear surged like a wildfire, but their desperate need smothered it, driving her deeper into this foreign realm. Their journey was a torturous crawl. What should have been a fleeting trek for a Hale-Bear family stretched into an epic of anguish and endurance. Vera halted often, her breaths ragged as she set Liska down on the cold, unfamiliar earth. Pavement here, grass there, urging Tavrin forward with soft nudges and low, coaxing rumbles. During these breaks, her gaze darted across the alien landscape. Rows of houses with shuttered eyes, fences looming like sentinels, the glint of glass catching the rising sun. Her anxiety swelling with every moment of exposure. The forest's whispers had taught her stealth, but here, beneath the open sky, she felt stripped bare, a shadow in a world not her own. The sun climbed higher, its light spilling over rooftops and lawns, when a distinct scent seized her senses, richer, more beckoning than the fleeting traces she'd chased. It wafted from a secluded yard, its borders framed by ancient trees and dense shrubs, a sanctuary whispering hope to her battered instincts. This haven belonged to Mara Kellen, though Vera had no inkling of the extraordinary tapestry her presence would weave. The property nestled at the end of a hushed lane, its backyard spilling into a wooded fringe where the wild still murmured. Bare fruit trees stood like silent promises along one side, their branches poised for summer's yield. while bird feeders swayed gently from gnarled limbs, scattering seeds that glinted in the dew. A small garden, freshly turned for spring, hugged a corner, its soil dark and fragrant with potential. With the last dregs of her strength, Vera shepherded Tavrin to the yard's edge, Liska's stillness in her jaws a dagger to her heart. The morning sun cast their plight in brutal clarity, ribs jutting like cruel ridges, fur dulled to a mournful sheen, limbs quivering with the weight of survival. A family on the precipice, their threadbare existence hanging by a whisper. Crossing into Mara's yard, Vera laid Liska in a cushion of soft grass beneath a towering oak, its gnarled branches casting dappled shadows over them. Tavrin crumpled beside his sister, too drained to lift his head, his breath's shallow gasps in the stillness. Vera stood over them, her massive form a sentinel against the unknown, her maternal fire clashing with the primal dread of this human place. Her ears flicked at every sound, a distant dog's bark, the creak of a waking house, her body tensed for flight or fight. Yet in that fragile moment, she surrendered their fate to chance, her amber eyes lifting to the sky as if pleading for a mercy she'd never sought before. Mara Kellen's morning unfurled in its quiet cadence as she descended her creaking stairs, the scent of roasted coffee beans curling through her cozy kitchen like a warm embrace. Sunlight streamed through the window, bathing her serene backyard in a golden glow that danced across the countertops. As she measured grounds into the pot, her gaze drifted outside, expecting the familiar flutter of sparrows and chickadees at her feeders, their cheerful squabbles a daily ritual. Instead, her heart jolted, a gasp catching in her throat as her eyes locked on three dark shapes beneath her oak, figures that would carve themselves into the fabric of her life forever. Her mind scrambled to parse the sight, disbelief warring with recognition. The largest was unmistakably a black bear, but its form defied the robust majesty she'd imagined from tales and fleeting glimpses in the wild. Gaunt beyond comprehension, its every rib stood out like a grim sculpture beneath patchy, lusterless fur, its posture a tableau of utter collapse, head bowed, shoulders slumped, as if the earth itself pulled it downward. Then her gaze fell to the cubs, and her hand flew to her mouth, stifling a cry that rose unbidden. Tavrin and Liska lay beside their mother, their states a deeper wound still. Liska was a motionless heap, her chest fluttering with breaths so faint they seemed a sigh from the grave, her tiny frame a skeleton swathed in dull scraps of fur. Tavrin lifted his head in weak, pitiful attempts to shift, only to collapse back onto the grass, his emaciated body a stark chronicle of starvation's toll. Tears welled in Mara's eyes, spilling over as their story unfolded in their hollowed forms. A family ravaged by a hunger that gnawed beyond endurance. Vera, sensing a presence, raised her head with a slowness that spoke of her frailty. What followed seared itself into Mara's soul. Instead of the fierce snarl or bared teeth she braced for, the bear's amber eyes met hers through the glass with a look that transcended the chasm between their kinds. Exhaustion shadowed them, yes, but threaded through it was a desperate, unguarded hope. A plea that carried no trace of the wild terror Mara expected. She stood rooted, tears streaming down her cheeks as Vera struggled to her feet, her massive frame swaying with the effort. Rather than bristling between her cubs and the stranger, a shield of maternal fury, she took unsteady steps toward the window, her movements not a threat but a supplication. She paused, glancing back at Tavrin and Liska, then returned her gaze to Mara, her eyes a mirror of anguish and trust. The truth crashed over Mara like a frigid wave. This mother hadn't wandered here by happenstance. She'd sought refuge, a final, reckless bid to save her dying cubs. Liska lay still, a fragile statue in the grass, while Tavrin's soft whimpers drifted through the morning air, each sound a shard piercing Mara's heart. Overwhelmed, she sank to the kitchen floor, her body trembling with sobs as the coffee maker's beep faded into the void. She knew the warnings. Don't feed bears, don't invite dependency, don't meddle with the wild's order. But this was no textbook case. This was a cry for compassion in the face of imminent loss. A mother's gamble laid bare at her feet. In that shattering moment, Mara made a choice that would spark a cascade of wonder. Her trembling hands reached for her phone, not for the cold efficiency of animal control or the law's heavy hand, but for Leora Vance, a friend and wildlife rehabilitator whose gentle expertise Mara had leaned on during her volunteer days at the shelter. As she waited for Leora's voice, her eyes remained fixed on the bear family, watching Vera nuzzle Tavrin and Liska with a tenderness that belied her collapse. The sun now blazed fully, its light merciless in revealing their devastation. Their skeletal frames stark against the grass, their fur a mournful shroud, Vera's massive head drooping as if too heavy for her wasted neck. Yet her gaze never wavered from Mara's window. It was a tableau of anguish teetering on the edge of hope, a breath held between ruin and redemption. When Leora's voice crackled through, Mara's words tumbled out in a flood of tears. "Leora, come quick. There's a mother bear and her cubs in my yard. They're starving, the cubs are dying. Please hurry, we have to help them." Her voice broke, but certainty anchored her. This was the precipice of change. Knowing every heartbeat counted, Mara scrambled to her pantry, hands shaking as she gathered honey, oats, and apples. Scraps of sustenance she knew bore risks. Years of wildlife talks echoed in her mind. Feeding bears courts danger, invites chaos, but these were no ordinary stakes. She feared Tavrin and Liska wouldn't survive the wait for formal aid, their frail threads fraying by the second. Leora arrived with the urgency of a storm, her truck rattling down the lane, its bed laden with emergency gear. Blankets, bottles, a crate of specialized supplies. Close behind rolled Dr. Cale Drace, the region's foremost wildlife veterinarian, who dropped his morning rounds at Leora's frantic call, his weathered face set with purpose. Their arrival stirred the quiet street. Neighbors emerged, bleary-eyed and curious, their murmurs rippling through group chats, summoning more hands. The experts moved with a practiced grace born of countless rescues. Dr. Cale raised his binoculars, peering at the cubs from a safe distance, his expression darkening as he catalogued their peril. Ribs like cruel bars, breaths too faint, life teetering. He mixed an emergency formula, a nutrient-rich lifeline for the malnourished, while Leora arranged feeding stations at careful intervals. Small piles of hope designed to coax without crowding. Mara watched through a veil of tears as Vera observed, her wariness softened by an uncanny calm. Defying every wild instinct, the bear showed no snarl, no bristling, just a stillness, as if she sensed salvation in these strangers. The first feeding hushed the growing crowd into reverent silence. Dr. Cale and Leora set out the mixture, soft mounds of formula, slices of apple, bits of protein-rich mash, then retreated, breath held. Vera approached, her steps a wobbly dance of exhaustion, sniffed the offering with a delicacy that belied her size, and then, stunningly, nudged Tavrin forward instead of eating. The cub stumbled, his frailty a jagged edge in every motion, and began to nibble, his tiny jaws working with desperate slowness. Soft sobs broke from the onlookers. Mara pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming as Vera carried Liska to the food, setting her down with a gentleness that shattered hearts, urging her cubs to eat first despite her own hollowed frame. Dr. Cale, eyes glistening, scribbled notes with a trembling hand. In 20 years of stitching wounds and coaxing life back into fading creatures, he'd never witnessed such a scene. Vera's trust, her sacrifice, her quiet intelligence defied all he'd known. He murmured to the crowd, voice thick, "This isn't just feeding bears. It's something extraordinary, a bridge between us and them." Vera ate last, her movements deliberate, her amber eyes flickering between her cubs and the humans, accepting the gift with a vigilance unbroken. The cubs' transformation flickered to life. Their eyes brightened, Liska stirring faintly, Tavrin lifting his head with renewed purpose. Neighbors, once armed with caution, now stood rapt, phones aloft, tears falling as they captured the moment, their whispers threading through the air. "Look at her. She knows, she trusts them." Social media ignited with their story, videos and photos racing beyond the town's borders, touching souls in distant corners. Leora and Dr. Cale paced the feedings, guarding against the dangers of too much too soon, plotting a recovery that would stretch beyond this fragile dawn. Vera's gratitude, her tender guidance of her cubs, wove a bond that transcended the wild's divide. A mother's plea answered by human hands. By afternoon, Mara's quiet street thrummed with compassion. Neighbors arrived, arms laden with bear-safe offerings vetted by Dr. Kale. Berries, nuts, slabs of fish from the market. Photographer Torin Vale slipped through the crowd, his lens tracing their arc from despair to fragile hope. Vera cradling her sleeping cubs, her eyes reflecting exhaustion and a glimmer of peace. Tavern's first tentative nibble, a beacon of life reborn. News anchor Celine Hart arrived, her crew in tow, but eschewed sensationalism for a narrative of unity. Her voice quavered as she spoke of Vera's gaunt arrival, the community's swell of care, the cubs' faint revival. The segment closed with Vera guiding Tavern and Liska to their food, a sight that left even her grizzled cameraman wiping his eyes. Wildlife groups rallied. Supplies rolled in from the Conservation Center. Experts from the State Bear Team descended to monitor and marvel. The emotional tide surged globally. Children mailed crayon sketches of the trio. Seniors offered pennies from their savings. Businesses piled donations high. Mara's yard morphed into a sanctuary. Volunteers forming shifts to watch from afar, charting each small gain. Tavern's steadier steps, Liska's faint wobble to her feet. Vera's trust deepened, her intelligence a quiet marvel. She kept her cubs at a wary distance yet accepted the rhythm of aid, her amber eyes tracking the humans with a knowing calm. Schools wove her tale into lessons. Essays sprouted on compassion's reach. Coins clinked into jars for wildlife funds. Tough workers wept openly. Elders parked along the lane to pray. Unity blossoming across once silent divides. Within a week, the cubs sparkled anew. Their dull eyes ignited with life, their frail shells rounding with nourishment. Mara's photojournal captured their ascent. From skeletal wraiths to glossy vigor, Vera's hollowed face blooming into the regal creature she'd once been. The cubs' first playful tumble, a clumsy roll beneath the oak, drew gasps of delight, soon swelling into a chorus of joyful chaos as they wrestled and chased shadows across the grass. Vera watched, her own strength unfurling enough to nudge them in gentle play, her contentment a quiet hymn. Dr. Kale's checks confirmed their resurgence. Vital signs steadying, weight climbing, wild vigor pulsing anew. Volunteers who'd wept through their darkest hours now shed tears of joy, Mara gazing from her window at a miracle she'd cradled. Videos of their antics raced online. Millions watched, sobbed, celebrated. The contrast from their arrival a gut punch of hope. Their saga spanned continents. Teachers in far-off classrooms, photographers in wild plains, stars on glittering stages lifted it high, sparking conservation's flame. Donations surged, policies bent. Vera's plight a lens on habitat's ruin, climate's toll. Her trust rewrote fears. Bears weren't mere threats but souls of depth, resilience, love. A girl's drawing arrived from across oceans, an elder's tale of hope from a hospital bed, humanity bound in their care. Researchers pored over her choices, seeking aid, not shunning it, appending wildlife script. Her story fueled cries for coexistence, a beacon in a shifting world. As summer loomed, the family stood reborn. Cubs sturdy and wild, Vera a vision of might, her coat a gleaming crown. Dr. Kale nodded, they were ready for the wild. The community gathered for a tearful farewell at Mara's yard, now hallowed by hope. Vera paused, her gaze sweeping her saviors, then led Tavern and Liska into the forest. Steps bold, a testament to mercy's triumph. Mara fixed a plaque beneath the oak, their legacy a pulse in changed hearts, a spur to guard the wild. Their tale became the town's soul, trust, compassion, unity's might, a light against despair. If their journey stirred you, subscribe for more. Hit the bell, share hope, join us in weaving the wild's healing song.